The day Arais Rahman signed the marriage papers, it felt less like a beginning, and more like a quiet sacrifice no one would ever truly understand. The room smelled faintly of ink and old paper, the ceiling fan hummed lazily above, and across from him sat a woman whose eyes had forgotten what hope looked like. He wasn't marrying for love. He wasn't even marrying for himself. He was marrying because a promise had been made beside a hospital bed, a promise to a dying friend who had held his hand with trembling fingers and whispered one last plea. And as Arais picked up the pen, his heart tightened with a question he dared not answer. What happens when a promise changes everything? If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet power of doing the right thing even when it costs you everything, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Spread Love Daily. Stories like this deserve to be felt, remembered, and passed on. Arais had always been the kind of man who carried more than his share of the world's weight without complaint. At 35, he had already lived through enough loss to make most people bitter, yet something inside him refused to harden. He worked as a modest school administrator, lived in a small but warm house on the edge of the city, and raised his 6-year-old son, Xavier, with quiet patience and deep love after losing his wife years ago. Life had taught him how fragile happiness was, and maybe that was why he held on to compassion like it was the only thing that truly mattered. His best friend, Farhan Qureshi, had been his opposite in many ways, loud, ambitious, full of life, but their bond had been unbreakable since childhood. Where Arais was calm, Farhan was fire. Where Arais hesitated, Farhan leaped. And yet, when illness struck Farhan unexpectedly, reducing him from a vibrant man to a fragile figure confined to a hospital bed, it was Arais who stayed by his side every single day. The illness was cruel and fast. Within months, it stole Farhan's strength, his voice, and eventually, his future. But it was not his own fate that haunted him most in those final days. It was his wife, Meher, and their young daughter, Alina. Meher had always been gentle, soft-spoken, someone who leaned on Farhan's strength in ways she never fully realized until it was gone. And Alina, she was only 5, too young to understand why her father no longer smiled the same way. On the night the machines in Farhan's hospital room beeped slower than usual, he reached for Arais with desperate urgency. His voice was barely a whisper, his eyes filled with fear not for himself, but for the 2 people he loved most. Arais leaned in close, holding his friend's hand as if he could anchor him to life. Farhan asked him to do something that felt impossible, to take care of Meher and Alina, not just as a friend, but as family. He asked Arais to marry Meher, to give his daughter a home where she would never feel abandoned, to ensure they would never be alone in a world that could be so unforgiving. It was not a request made lightly, and it was not a promise Arais gave easily. But looking into the fading eyes of the men who had once stood beside him through every storm, Arais nodded. He promised. And within hours, Farhan was gone. The days that followed were heavy with grief. Meher moved through them like a ghost, her silence louder than any scream. Alina clung to her mother, confused and frightened, asking questions that no one could answer without breaking. Arais visited often, bringing groceries, helping with small tasks, trying to fill the gaps left behind. But each visit reminded him of the promise he had made, a promise that now felt like a responsibility far greater than anything he had ever carried. When Arais finally brought up the idea of marriage to Meher, it was not out of courage but necessity. The world they lived in was not kind to widows and single mothers. People talked, judged, questioned. Security mattered, stability mattered, and he knew Farhan had understood that. Meher resisted at first, her grief too fresh, her heart too shattered to even consider such a step. But slowly, with time and gentle conversations, she agreed, not because she wanted to, but because she saw no other way to protect her daughter's future. The marriage was simple, almost painfully so. No celebration, no joy, just quiet signatures and heavy hearts. They returned home not as a newly married couple, but as 2 people bound by circumstance, carrying their own grief and trying not to let it spill over. Life under one roof was complicated. Arais tried to be respectful, giving Meher space, never forcing conversation, never crossing boundaries. He slept in a separate room, maintained distance, and focused most of his energy on the children. Xavier was curious but kind, accepting Alina as a sister with a natural innocence that only children possess. Alina, on the other hand, was cautious. She watched Arais with wide, uncertain eyes, unsure of who he was meant to be in her life. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, a fragile rhythm formed. Arais would prepare breakfast, pack school bags, and walk both children to school. Meher would manage the house, her quiet presence gradually becoming less distant. There were small moments, shared meals, brief smiles, the soft laughter of children that hinted at something more than just obligation. But still, there was an invisible wall between Arise and Meher, built from grief, uncertainty, and unspoken emotions. Then one evening, something changed. Alina fell sick, her small body burning with fever, her cries echoing through the house. Meher panicked, her composure shattering as she struggled to comfort her daughter. It was Arise who stepped in without hesitation, carrying Alina in his arms, rushing her to the hospital, staying by her side through the long night. He held her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep, whispered comforting words, and refused to leave even when exhaustion weighed heavily on him. For the first time, Meher saw something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. This wasn't just a man fulfilling a promise. This was someone who cared, deeply, genuinely, without expectation. And something inside her, something she had buried with Farhan, stirred faintly. From that night on, the dynamic began to shift. Meher started speaking more, sharing small details of her day, asking Arise about his work. Their conversations were hesitant at first, but gradually became more natural. They began to function not just as co-parents, but as partners in the quiet, unspoken sense. Yet, just as things began to settle, the unexpected happened. One afternoon, while sorting through old belongings, Meher found a letter tucked away in Farhan's drawer. It was addressed to Arise but had never been given to him. With trembling hands, she opened it, unsure of whether she had the right. What she read changed everything she thought she knew. Farhan had written the letter weeks before his death. In it, he spoke not only of his fears, but of his hopes. He confessed that he had seen something between Arise and Meher long before his illness, something unspoken, something neither of them had acknowledged. He wrote that he trusted Arise not just because he was his best friend, but because he knew Arise's heart. And most shockingly, he wrote that he didn't want their marriage to be just an obligation. He wanted it to become real. Someday. Meher's hands shook as tears blurred her vision. The weight of those words settled deep within her, forcing her to confront emotions she had been too afraid to face. Had she truly been blind to something that had always been there? Or was Farhan simply hoping for a future that felt too impossible to imagine? That evening, when Arise returned home, she handed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer empty, it was filled with questions, possibilities, and a truth neither of them could ignore anymore. From that moment, everything began to change. The distance between them started to fade, replaced by a cautious closeness. They began to see each other not as obligations, but as individuals with shared pain and growing understanding. Laughter came easier, conversations lasted longer, and the house, once filled with quiet sorrow, began to feel like a home again. Arise found himself noticing the small things about Meher, the way she smiled when Alina laughed, the quiet strength she carried despite everything she had endured. And Meher, in turn, began to see Arise not just as the man who kept a promise, but as someone who had become essential to their lives in ways she could no longer deny. Months passed, and what had started as a forced union slowly transformed into something neither of them had expected. Love, not the kind that arrives with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the kind that grows quietly, patiently, through shared moments, mutual respect, and the healing of broken hearts. And one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of gold and amber, Arise realized something that took his breath away. The promise he had once made out of duty had given him something he thought he had lost forever, a chance at a family, at happiness, at love. If this story has touched your heart even a little, take a moment to like, comment, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Your support keeps these stories alive and meaningful. And before we reach the end, tell me in the comments, do you believe love can grow from responsibility, or does it need to exist from the beginning? In the quiet warmth of that evening, as Alina and Xavier played in the yard and Meher stood beside him, Arise understood that sometimes, the most unexpected paths lead to